If you've lived in Florida long enough, there's a good chance you've passed places most people don't even realize exist. Across this state are communities and hidden locations that disappeared for reasons most people have never heard about. These are 12 Florida places I bet you didn't know exist, and number 1 is the one that stays with you. Number 12. Indian Key, Florida. This was a man-made empire on a tiny island in the middle of the Florida Keys, run by one of the most ruthless characters on the American frontier, who bribed politicians into making his private island its own county, and then asked the U.S. government to pay him to capture Seminole warriors before the whole thing collapsed in a single night. Jacob Houseman arrived in Key West in 1822 and immediately saw the opening. Ships ran aground on Florida's Reef constantly, and whoever got there first collected a cut of everything they salvaged. Key West had locked up that business, and Houseman wanted in on his own terms. He bought the 8-acre island of Indian Key for almost nothing, and over the next decade built a genuine town on it. A hotel with a bowling alley, warehouses, nearly 30 houses and workshops, wharves, all of it his. Around 150 people lived there at its peak, and the island was starting to rival Key West itself. Houseman was not careful about how he made his money. Some accounts say his men occasionally helped ships onto the Reef rather than off it. After losing his wrecking license in 1836, he got the Florida Territorial Legislature to carve out a brand new county, Dade County, with Indian Key as its seat, filled the courthouse with his own people, and made himself effectively the law on his own little island. By 1840, he was nearly broke and desperate enough to ask the federal government to pay him $200 a person to capture Seminole warriors. They said no, but the request made it into the official record. On the night of August 7, 1840, a band of Seminole warriors led by Chief Chakaika paddled to Indian Key in canoes, landed before dawn, and attacked. Most residents jumped into the water and survived by hiding under the docks for hours. Among them, Henry Perrine's 16-year-old daughter, who stayed underwater in the dark while the buildings above her burned, and later wrote the most detailed account of the attack anyone has ever found. 13 people didn't make it, including the botanist Henry Perrine himself, who had been waiting on the island for a land grant. Virtually every building burned, and Houseman, who got away, died in a boating accident the following year. Today, Indian Key is a state park you can only reach by kayak or boat. The streets are still there, marked with signs from 1st to 5th Street, carved through an island that's been completely taken over by jungle. You can walk the grid of a county seat that doesn't exist anymore, in a county that no longer bears its name. Number 11. Stiltsville, Florida. There are 7 wooden houses sitting on stilts in the middle of Biscayne Bay, 1 mile off the Miami coast, and they are what is left of one of the most gloriously lawless communities in American history, a place most people have driven past 100 times without ever knowing it was there. It started in the early 1930s when a man known as Crawfish Eddie Walker planted a barge in the shallows, just far enough from shore that nobody had clear authority to stop him, and proceeded to sell bait, beer, and by most accounts quite a bit of contraband. Miami was right there, but the law would have to get in a boat to reach him, and apparently that was far enough. By the 1940s and 1950s, Stiltsville had grown to 27 structures, houses, clubs, and the legendary Quarterdeck Club, which Life magazine called the premier place to be seen in Miami. Judges, politicians, and the city's wealthiest families owned places out here, with parties that lasted for days and police raids that never seemed to turn up anything serious. One raid in 1949 came up empty, and another a few years later at a junior Chamber of Commerce party turned up gambling and what the police report called lewd literature. Hurricanes and time reduced 27 structures to 7. When Biscayne National Park was established in 1980, the houses were suddenly sitting on federal land, and the government sent eviction notices. The residents fought back. They organized, got a congresswoman involved, collected 75,000 signatures, and testified in front of Congress more than 5 times. In 2003, a deal was struck. The houses would stay as historic landmarks but could no longer be privately used. Today, the 7 houses stand empty above the bay, maintained by a group called the Stiltsville Trust. You need a permit to go out there, and the parties have been over for decades, but they are still there, exactly 1 mile from one of the largest cities in America, in a spot that most Floridians will never see. Number 10. Ellaville, Florida. This is the story of a future Florida governor who built the largest sawmill in the state, named the town after the woman he had enslaved, got rich enough to run the whole state, and then watched everything he built get swallowed by the same river it was built on. George Franklin Drew came to Florida after the Civil War with money, drive, and a partner named Louis Bucci, a Prussian immigrant who understood machinery. They put up a steam-powered sawmill on the western bank of the Suwannee River and named the place Ellaville, after Ella, a woman Drew had enslaved for years. By the early 1870s, the mill was the biggest in Florida, running 500 workers, with a railroad going straight to the mill, a steamboat dock, churches, schools, a Masonic lodge, 1,000 people, and enough success that Drew was elected governor of Florida in 1876, one of the richest men in the state with a mansion on the riverbank. Then in 1898, the mill burned. They rebuilt it, but there wasn't enough quality timber left to run it the way it had been. All the best yellow pine had already been cleared out of the surrounding forests. By 1900, it was over. Drew died that same year in Jacksonville, reportedly just hours after making funeral arrangements for his wife, of what one local paper described as a broken heart. The Suwannee River started flooding the town more and more through the early 1900s. In 1928, it sent 6 feet of water into the mansion and pushed out whoever was still there. A new store was built that year, and the man who built it was found shot in front of it the following year. The post office shut down in 1942, and that was the end of Ellaville. What's left today is an old bridge, the rotting shell of the river store, and one of the mill's massive flywheels sitting on display at the nearby state park. The governor's town, named for a woman who had no say in the matter, went back to the river it was built on. Number 9. Atsina, Otiki, Florida. Every pencil you used in school most likely came from a factory on an island that doesn't exist anymore. Half a mile off the Florida Gulf Coast, wiped off the map by a hurricane in a single night in 1896, leaving nothing behind but a trail through the jungle and a cemetery the salt air has been wearing down for 130 years. Atsina Otiki was the original Cedar Key, the actual settlement, the working island, the place where the Eberhard Faber Pencil Company set up a mill to turn Florida's red cedar into the slats that became pencils sold all over the country and shipped to Germany. By the 1880s, there were over 200 people living there, families who had been on the island for generations, a school, a post office, the whole thing. The pencil mill was what made it run. There was one problem that crept up slowly. The cedar forests were being cut down faster than they could grow back. By the mid-1890s, the supply was visibly running thin. The economy was already wobbling, and then the morning of September 29th, 1896, showed up with a sky one fisherman described as sunshine through heavy fog with an unbearable heat, a sky unlike anything he had seen before. The 1896 Cedar Keys hurricane hit with winds over 125 miles per hour and a 10-foot wall of water that swept across the entire island, wiping out nearly every building and killing more than 30 people. The pencil mill was gone. The company looked at what was left, a wrecked island with barely any cedar remaining anyway, and decided it wasn't worth rebuilding. The survivors moved to the mainland, half a mile away. Today, the island is part of the Cedar Keys National Wildlife Refuge, reachable only by boat or kayak. A trail cuts through the overgrowth to the mill ruins and the old cemetery, where headstones worn smooth by a century and a half of salt air mark the graves of the people who built something the Gulf took in a single night. Number 8. Fort Dade, Florida. Here is something that will genuinely surprise you. There is a complete ghost town on an island right at the entrance to Tampa Bay. Brick streets still intact, a bowling alley, a movie theater, a school, and an 1858 lighthouse that is still flashing, and almost nobody in Tampa knows it's there. Fort Dade was built on Egmont Key starting in 1898 to protect Tampa Bay from a naval attack that never came. The Spanish-American War was basically over before the fort was even finished, but the Army kept it going anyway. At its peak, around 300 people lived out there. Soldiers, families, and the staff needed to run the place in a surprisingly well-equipped island community with electricity, phones, a bowling alley, a tennis court, and a movie theater, all of it only reachable by boat. The fort shut down in 1923 and everyone left. Florida's heat and humidity did the rest. Vegetation tears apart abandoned buildings here faster than almost anywhere else in the country, and whatever the vines missed, the hurricanes eventually got. Today, Egmont Key is a state park you can only reach by private boat or a seasonal ferry from Fort DeSoto. When you get there, you can walk the original brick streets, still laid out in their original pattern, running straight into the jungle, with that lighthouse still doing its job at the mouth of the bay, just like it has been since 1858. If this kind of story is what you watch this channel for, subscribe. We go deeper every single week. Number 7. Akron, Florida. 40 miles north of Walt Disney World, deep in the Ocala National Forest, there is a piece of land where Walt Disney's mother once taught school. His parents got married, and the family that would eventually give the world Mickey Mouse spent the early years of their life together in a town that has completely ceased to exist. Akron started in the 1860s as a small farming and timber settlement near Paisley, on what was then the wild edge of Central Florida. About 300 people lived there at its height. The two-story log building in the center of town was the school, the church, and the meeting hall all rolled into one, and the local postmaster ran the post office out of the same home he used as the community hotel. In 1884, a young woman named Flora Call came to Akron from Kansas with her family and started teaching at the local school. A young man named Elias Disney had followed the Call family all the way from Kansas because he was in love with Flora and was living nearby. On January 1st, 1888, they were married in the settlement of Kismet just down the road. The very first couple to receive a marriage license from the newly formed Lake County, Florida. After the wedding, they lived in Akron for a while. Their son Walt was born in Chicago in 1901. The piece of ground where his parents fell in love is sitting 40 miles north of the park he built. Akron faded out in the early 1900s as the timber economy shifted and railroad towns took over from the small frontier settlements. Today, a cemetery near Paisley holds the graves of Walt Disney's grandparents, and the town where his mother taught school is Forest Floor. Number 6. Rollstown, Florida. Most Florida ghost towns died because a business failed or a storm hit. This one was abandoned overnight because Britain lost a war, which makes it one of the oldest ghost town sites in the entire country, and from a piece of Florida's history that most people don't even know existed. In 1767, a British aristocrat named Dennis Rowley showed up in Florida with 200 people he had pulled from the streets and prisons of London, promising them land and a fresh start in the New World. Florida was a British territory at the time. Spain had handed it over just 4 years earlier, and Rolla had been given an enormous stretch of land along the St. Johns River, where he planned to prove that even London's most desperate people could be turned into productive settlers through hard work on a Florida plantation. It fell apart almost immediately. The indentured workers weren't built for Florida's heat, the bugs, or the backbreaking labor, and they started walking off the job within weeks. Roll tracked them down, dragged them back under the terms of their contracts, and watched them leave again. He eventually brought in enslaved Africans, and the plantation limped along for another decade. Then, in 1783, Britain handed Florida back to Spain as part of ending the American Revolutionary War, and most of the British settlers in Florida just left within months, Roll among them, going back to England, while the enslaved people at Rollistown were eventually moved to the Bahamas, where their descendants built a community that still exists on Exuma today, and the plantation on the St. Johns River was left to the wild. Today there's a historical marker on US 17 near East Palatka, and almost nothing else. One of the oldest abandoned sites in the country, from a version of Florida that existed before the United States did. Number 5. Vineland, Florida. This is the ghost town that Walt Disney World ate. Vineland was a quiet little Orange County community that had been there since the early 1900s. Houses, a school, a church, a railroad depot, a cemetery, just a normal small-town Florida life in the flatlands west of Orlando. In the early 1960s, Walt Disney's company started secretly buying up land in Central Florida through shell companies, specifically so sellers wouldn't catch on and jack up the prices. Over about 18 months, they quietly put together a piece of land nearly 43 square miles, bigger than San Francisco, paying around $185 an acre at a time when similar land nearby was already going for over $1,000 an acre. That gap saved them what would add up to to hundreds of millions of dollars. When Disney announced the whole thing in November 1965, even the people who had sold were floored by how big it was. Vineland was in the middle of that land. The residents got bought out, the town got torn down, and what had been a community was flattened to become the foundation of the most visited place on Earth. The Vineland Cemetery survived and is still there today, sitting on Fenton Street inside the Walt Disney World Resort, surrounded by hotels and parking lots and the whole machinery of a theme park empire. Roads all over Orange County still carry the Vineland name. Every year, millions of people drive down Apopka Vineland Road on their way to Disney World, and not one of them has any idea there was a town. Number 4. Aladdin City, Florida. What if someone tried to build the Arabian Nights in the middle of a Florida swamp? In 1925, someone actually did, and it was gone before most of the streets were even paved. The 1920s Florida land boom was unlike anything the country had seen. People were buying and flipping the same swampland multiple times in a single day, and developers were selling land that barely existed with fancy brochures and zero roads. Into this madness came D.P. Davis, who had just pulled off one of the biggest wins of the boom. Davis Island's in Tampa Bay, an artificial island he built from scratch that became a massive success. Riding that wave, Davis went after something that made Davis Islands look modest, a whole city in the Redlands area south of Miami, designed entirely around Moorish and Arabian architecture, with arched buildings, ornamental towers, and streets named after characters from 1001 Nights. He called it Aladdin City. The boom collapsed in 1926 after a string of devastating hurricanes stripped away the illusion that any of this was real, and Aladdin City, which had barely gotten off the ground, went with it. The few prefabricated homes that had actually been assembled got swallowed by the surrounding farmland. Almost nothing is left today, just a quiet stretch of Miami-Dade County, where a few old buildings still have faint Moorish details if you know what you're looking for. Most people drive right through without any idea that someone once tried to drop the Arabian Nights into the Florida Redlands and ran out of time before the first chapter was finished. Number 3. Hampton Springs, Florida. In the middle of the Florida Panhandle pine forest, there is a 150-room luxury resort that most people will never find. Crumbling concrete walls, a casino, a ballroom, and a set of sulfur springs that are still flowing deep in the trees of Taylor County, 60 years after a fire ended it all. Hampton Springs Hotel opened in 1909, and it was genuinely impressive. 150 rooms, a ballroom, a casino, formal gardens, a covered promenade along the springs, and a private railroad spur built just to bring guests in from Tallahassee and across the southeast. At its height in the 1920s, it was considered one of the best resort destinations in the South, drawing the kind of guests and hosting the kind of parties that the remoteness of Taylor County helped keep off the front page. The Depression hit it hard, rail traffic fell off, and the new highway system was built in a way that left Taylor County behind. By the late 1940s, the hotel was barely hanging on, and in 1954, a fire tore through the main building. It never reopened. Today, the ruins are down a dirt road in the pine forest, crumbling walls, the foundations of the promenade, the spring pools still visible under the overgrowth, with the springs themselves still running while the trees slowly take back everything around them. It is genuinely one of the most cut-off feeling places in Florida, and almost nobody knows it's there. Number 2. Brewster, Florida. Most ghost towns look like ghost towns. Brewster doesn't, because the company that built it actually tried to make it feel like a real town, and when they walked away, they left behind one of the most preserved abandoned communities in the entire state. Brewster was built in 1919 in Polk County to house the workers of a phosphate mining operation. What went up wasn't a row of identical company shacks. It was a genuinely designed neighborhood with curved streets, a central park, a company store, a church, and houses with front porches and proper lawns. There was a school for white workers' children and a separate school for black workers' children, because that's how Florida was run in 1919, and the company built accordingly. At its peak, around 1,000 people lived there, in a place that looked from the outside like a perfectly normal small Florida town. When the phosphate ran out, the company wound things down in the 1960s, moved the residents out, boarded up the buildings, and left Brewster standing. They kept ownership of the property, and the site just sat there, barely touched, for decades. What's left is extraordinary. A whole town preserved almost exactly as it was on the day the last resident left, slowly falling apart in the middle of a Polk County phosphate wasteland that most Floridians blow past on I-4 without a second thought. The company built it to look real and just forgot to keep it alive. Number 1. Eldora, Florida. Most people have no idea there is a ghost town sitting inside Canaveral National Seashore, a citrus village that one cold night in 1895 killed completely, that a national park then absorbed and left untouched for 130 years, while rockets launched and tourists swarmed, and the whole modern world built up around it. Eldora started in the 1880s on the barrier island that is now part of Canaveral National Seashore, right along the Indian River Lagoon. Settlers put in citrus groves across the hammock land, and by the early 1890s, it was a working little community. Houses, a general store, a school, a church, a boat dock for supplies, the Indian River in front and forest behind. It looked like it had a future. Then, in February 1895, the Great Freeze hit. Temperatures dropped below 20 degrees for 2 nights in a row, something Central Florida had never recorded. Every single citrus tree was killed down to the root overnight. Groves that had taken a decade to grow were gone in 48 hours. Most families left immediately. Without the citrus, there was no reason to stay. The land eventually became part of Canaveral National Seashore. Because nobody cleared it or built on it after the freeze, the site has been essentially untouched for 130 years. The original general store is still there, preserved as a weekend museum. The old cemetery is still there. The hammock forest has grown back over where the groves used to be. Most people who come to this part of Florida are there for the space launches. The ones who find their way to Eldora find something else entirely, a place where the silence that fell on one cold night in 1895 is still, somehow, holding. Drop a comment and tell me what part of Florida you're from so we can explore the past around it in the next video. Subscribe so you don't miss it.